By the turn of the 20th century, one brewery in Munich controlled more beer production than any other company in all of Germany. 600 years of heritage, a lion stitched into the soul of Bavaria, a name that roared across 5 continents and poured into the glasses of presidents, working men, and royalty alike. Walk into any great city in Europe at the height of Löwenbräu's power and you would find the lion. On restaurant menus in Paris, on barroom shelves in London, displayed like a trophy in the grand beer halls of Munich, where the Löwenbräu Keller stretched across an entire city block, its ornate walls echoing with the laughter of thousands who had gathered in the amber glow of gaslight and glory. At its peak, Löwenbräu produced more than 1.5 million hectoliters of beer in a single brewing season. It employed hundreds of workers. Its real estate holdings made it one of the largest private landowners in Munich. It was one of only 6 breweries on Earth permitted to pour at Oktoberfest, that ancient festival of Bavarian identity. It was, by every measure that mattered, an empire built on hops, tradition, and an almost religious devotion to purity. Then something went catastrophically wrong. Not in one moment, not with a single decision, but across decades, through 2 world wars, a Nazi boycott, an American identity crisis, and a hostile corporate absorption, the lion began to shrink. Today, Löwenbräu is a brand managed from an office in Bremen. Its greatest competitor once stood next door. The world's largest brewing conglomerate now owns its name. So how does the most powerful brewery in Germany, 6 centuries of dominance, end up as a footnote inside a corporate portfolio? This is the story of rise, ruin, and the slow erasure of a legend. This is the story of Löwenbräu. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. It means a great deal to us, and it helps more people discover stories like this one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. 1524, Munich, Bavaria. A city that smelled of river water, bread, and wood smoke. A city where the streets were narrow and the seasons were hard, and where the people had long since decided that beer was not merely a drink, it was a way of life. Into this world, a man named Jörg Schneider appeared in the tax records at a property on Löwenbräu 17. He was a Bierpreu, a beer brewer, and the address where he lived and worked would, over the next 5 centuries, give birth to one of the most recognizable brands in the history of German industry. Nobody planned it that way. Nobody sat down in 1524 and said, "This will be the beginning of something enormous." Schneider simply brewed beer, as men in Munich had done for generations before him. The street was called Löwengrube, the lion's pit, and somewhere on the walls of the building, a 17th century fresco depicted the biblical figure of Daniel standing among lions. That image, painted on crumbling plaster in a narrow Bavarian alley, would one day become the icon of a global brand. The name Löwenbräu itself, Lion's Brew, did not appear in any official brewery registry until the 20th of April, 1747. For more than 2 centuries after Schneider first moved into that building, the operation remained modest, unremarkable, just another small brewer in a city full of them. The water flowed cold and clean from the Alps. The hops grew thick in the Bavarian fields. The raw materials were exceptional. But the vision required to make something truly historic had not yet arrived. It arrived in 1818. That year, a man named Georg Brey, a brewer of peasant origins, the son of ordinary people with calloused hands and practical ambitions, purchased the brewery at what was then a modest transaction price. He had no grand political connections. He was not a nobleman. He was a craftsman who understood the soil his barley grew in and the cold that kept his cellars pure. Within a decade of his purchase, Georg Brey had transformed the brewery completely. By 1827, he was expanding operations to a second site at Unterwiesenfeld off Nymphenburger Strasse. He secured permission to brew Bock beer, the stronger, darker style that Bavarian drinkers craved in the colder months. He built new cellars. He invested in modern equipment when other small brewers remained stubborn in their old ways. The lion was no longer a fresco on a wall. It was beginning to breathe. 1863, Nymphenburger Strasse, Munich. The move to the new brewery location had been completed 12 years earlier, in 1851. Now the full machinery of Löwenbräu's ambition was running at speed, and the numbers told a remarkable story. By the brewing year of 1863 and 64, Löwenbräu had surpassed every other brewery in the city. Its market share reached 25% of all beer produced in Munich. 1 in every 4 liters poured in the Bavarian capital came from the lion's house. Georg Brey had done what seemed impossible for a man of his background. But it was his son, Löwenbräu, who would carry the brewery to its next transformation. In 1872, Löwenbräu made a decision that changed the nature of the company forever. He converted Löwenbräu into a joint stock corporation, formally registered as Aktien Brauerei zum Löwenbräu. The company was no longer a family holding. It had shareholders. It had boards. It had the structure of a modern industrial enterprise. And with that structure came access to capital that the old Bray family model could never have generated. Löwenbräu was meticulous, bold, and possessed of an instinct for spectacle. In 1882 and 1883, he commissioned the Rank brothers, a prominent architectural firm, to design something the city had never seen. Working from plans by the architect Albert Schmidt, the Rank brothers built the Löwenbräu Keller, a palatial beer hall at Stiegelmeierplatz attached to the brewery itself. On the 14th of June, 1883, the grand opening drew thousands. It was not merely a restaurant, it was a monument, an architectural declaration that Löwenbräu had arrived as a civic institution. In 1886, the lion trademark was registered, official, permanent, protected. Then came the honor that made Munich fall silent with pride. At the Paris World Exhibition of 1900, Löwenbräu was awarded the Grand Prix, the highest possible recognition for quality. European judges, French judges, declared the Bavarian Lion's beer the finest they had encountered. And by the turn of the century, Löwenbräu was not merely the largest brewery in Munich, it was the largest brewery in all of Germany. The problem was that nothing that large stays unchallenged forever. The 20th century had just begun, and it would test the lion in ways that Georg Bray never could have imagined. 1516. The court of Wilhelm IV, Duke of Bavaria. More than 3 centuries before Löwenbräu rose to dominance, the foundation of its eventual greatness was already being written into law. On the 23rd of April, 1516, Duke Wilhelm IV issued the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law. It was among the oldest food safety regulations in history. Its mandate was simple and absolute. Beer could be made with only 4 ingredients: water, barley malt, hops, and yeast. No corn, no rice, no artificial preservatives, no shortcuts. This was not merely a regulation. For brewers like those who would one day manage Löwenbräu, it was a covenant, a contract between the brewer and the people he served, written in the language of integrity. And Löwenbräu built its entire identity on that covenant. The water that flowed into the brewery on Nymphenburger Strasse came from the deep wells beneath Munich. Water filtered through the limestone and granite of the Bavarian Alps, cold and mineral clean. The hops came from Hallertau, the world's largest hop-growing region just north of Munich, producing the noble Hallertau variety, earthy, spicy, never harsh. The barley malt was sourced from the fields of southern Germany, where the growing season and the soil produced grain of extraordinary quality. Every liter of Löwenbräu that left the brewery was the product of this geography. You could not replicate it in Milwaukee. You could not reproduce it in Chicago. The water was different. The hops were different. The entire natural ecosystem that produced the taste of Löwenbräu was specific to this corner of Bavaria. That specificity was the source of immense competitive advantage. But it was also, as the brewery would discover many decades later, a catastrophic vulnerability the moment it tried to expand beyond those borders. By the early 20th century, Löwenbräu's commitment to the Reinheitsgebot was more than tradition. It was marketing. Labels bore the purity law's heritage. Export campaigns in England and across Europe pointed to it as proof of superiority. The Lion's Brew was pure, authentic, ancient, uncompromising. The world was buying it, and for a moment, the empire was at its most magnificent. But here's the thing about empires built on purity. The world eventually sends something impure their way, and the 20th century had a great deal of impurity prepared for Löwenbräu. 1914. The German Empire enters a world at war. For Löwenbräu, the consequences arrived swiftly and without mercy. The brewery's London export depot, a carefully built commercial outpost representing years of international ambition, was shuttered. Its staff made redundant. The British market, one of the most valuable destinations for premium German beer, was now an enemy market. Overnight, the export revenues that had helped fund expansion and modernization simply vanished. Inside Germany, the situation was no better. The military government imposed rationing on every raw material needed to brew beer. Barley was diverted to feed soldiers. Coal for the boilers became scarce. The brewer's relationship with the Reinheitsgebot, that sacred covenant of purity, was strained to its limits. To keep production running, the brewery was forced to produce what was internally called dünn beer, thin beer, reduced alcohol, reduced body, reduced quality. It was the first time in its modern history that Löwenbräu had compromised on what it poured. By the armistice of 1918, sales had collapsed to roughly 50% of their pre-war levels. Half. The largest brewery in Germany was operating at half capacity, producing a product that embarrassed its own brewmasters. Then came a decision that would reshape the company forever. In 1921, Löwenbräu merged with two other breweries. The first was Unionsbrau Schulein und Sie, founded in 1885 and run by a man named Joseph Schulein. The second was Munich Burgerbrau. Both mergers were completed in the same year, and both brought assets the battered Lion desperately needed. More property, more production capacity, more market reach. The merger retained the Löwenbräu name. It was the older and more prestigious of the three brands. But along with the properties came something unexpected. The merged corporation's new supervisory board included Joseph Schulein, who was Jewish. In the Germany of the 1920s, that fact was already becoming dangerous. But for the moment, growth resumed. The brewery added a Weiss beer to its portfolio in 1927. In 1928, annual production exceeded 1 million hectoliters for the first time. The Lion was roaring again. Nobody in the executive offices on Nymphenburgerstrasse fully understood what was already gathering in the city around them. Something catastrophic was being organized in the beer halls of Munich itself. And one of those beer halls now belonged to Löwenbräu. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We're only halfway through the Lion story, and the most dramatic chapters are still to come. The 8th of November, 1923. The Burgerbraukeller, Munich. The beer hall had been one of the most celebrated entertainment venues in Bavaria. Enormous in scale, capable of holding thousands, it sat in the eastern part of Munich and had become a regular gathering point for political meetings, concerts, and the endless civic discussions of post-war German life. That November night, it was full of people who had come to hear a political address by Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the state commissioner of Bavaria. They had not expected Adolf Hitler. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, Hitler and roughly 600 members of the Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary SA, surrounded the building. Hitler entered the hall, fired a shot into the ceiling, and declared that the national revolution had begun. He forced Kahr and two other Bavarian leaders into a side room at gunpoint. By the time morning came, the Putsch had collapsed. The police clashed with Nazi stormtroopers on the streets. 16 of Hitler's supporters were killed. Hitler himself was arrested and later convicted of high treason. That beer hall, the Burgerbraukeller, belonged to Löwenbräu. The merger of 1921 had brought it into the corporation's property portfolio, and now one of the most infamous nights in German history had unfolded inside a building the brewery owned. It was not Löwenbräu's fault. The brewery had no control over who rented its halls. But the association, the proximity to that particular night, meant that the Lion's name would forever be linked to the darkest chapter of German politics. And the darkness was only beginning. Joseph Schulein, the Jewish businessman whose Unionsbrau had merged with Löwenbräu in 1921, eventually passed control of the company to his son Hermann Schulein in the early 1930s. By then, the Nazi Party had risen to power. By then, anti-Jewish boycotts were spreading across Germany like wildfire through dry timber. The Nazis had a name for Löwenbräu. They called it Judenbier, Jews' beer. The party called for a national boycott of the brand. Dr. Hermann Schulein did not wait to see where that boycott led. He fled Munich, fled Germany, and eventually took a senior position at the Liebmann Brewery in New York City. There, working alongside Philipp Liebmann, he helped develop a dry lager called Rheingold, a beer so successful that by the 1950s and 60s, Liebmann's output was 10 times that of the brewery Hermann had left behind. The irony was almost unbearable. 1945, Munich, Germany. The Allied air campaign over Bavaria had been methodical and merciless. By the final months of the Second World War, the city of Munich lay broken. The grand civic architecture that had made it one of Europe's most beautiful capitals was reduced in many places to rubble and ash. The breweries, the concert halls, the beer gardens, all of it subject to the brutal arithmetic of strategic bombing. The Löwenbräu brewery on Nymphenburger Straße took a direct hit. The bombing of 1945 destroyed the main production facilities. The Lion's House, 600 years of accumulated brewing tradition, was reduced to ruins in a single night of Allied air raids. It should have been the end. In any ordinary history, the destruction of a brewery's physical plant during wartime, combined with the exile of its Jewish leadership, the Nazi boycott, 2 world wars of lost export revenue, and the severe rationing of raw materials, would constitute a complete and irreversible collapse. Most breweries that suffered this combination of blows never reopened. Löwenbräu reopened. After the war ended, a carefully negotiated agreement was reached between the surviving management of the brewery and the Schulein heirs, the family that had fled to America. That agreement ensured the brewery's legal and financial continuity. It was a rare moment of post-war justice in an industry that had been badly damaged by persecution. Reconstruction began. By 1948, just 3 years after the bombs, Löwenbräu had resumed the export of its beer. The first market it returned to was Switzerland. Quiet, neutral, a symbolic choice. The Lion was not yet ready to announce its return to the world, but it was breathing again, rebuilding, stone by stone. Throughout the 1950s, the recovery accelerated. The brewery invested in new equipment. The Mathaser Bierstadt, a vast entertainment complex the brewery had acquired in 1907, was converted after 1957 into an elaborate gastronomic venue hosting 5,000 guests across 16 different restaurants and beer halls. Munich was rebuilding its identity as a city of celebration. Löwenbräu was at the center of that revival. And then came the 1960s. The export ambitions returned. The brand began pushing beyond Switzerland. The Lion was looking west. Specifically, it was looking across the Atlantic. America was waiting. But America had its own ideas about what Löwenbräu should be. 1810. The Fields of Theresienwiese, Munich. The first Oktoberfest was not a beer festival. It was a celebration, a public gathering held on the 12th of October, 1810, to honor the marriage of Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria and Princess Theresa of Saxe-Hildburghausen. The fields where the people gathered, vast meadows at the edge of the city, took the princess's name, the Wiesen, the meadow. And because it was Bavaria, and because Bavaria was Bavaria, there was beer. Löwenbräu was there from the beginning. Not because it was the largest brewery in Munich, not because it had connections at the royal court, but because of a rule that has remained unchanged and unyielding for more than 2 centuries. Only beer brewed within the city limits of Munich, using water from Munich's deep wells, may be served at Oktoberfest. That geographical requirement created a permanent oligopoly of 6 breweries: Augustinerbrau, Hofbrau, Hackerschor, Paulaner, Spaten, and Löwenbräu, that has endured from 1810 to the present day. The Löwenbräu tent at Oktoberfest became one of the festival's great institutions. In the 1950s, the brewery introduced its most beloved attraction, a giant mechanical roaring lion mounted above the entrance to the tent, its mouth opening and closing, its mechanical roar audible across the Wiesen. Festival goers navigated by it. It became a landmark within a festival of landmarks. For the Oktoberfest, Löwenbräu brewed a special Märzen beer, a rich, amber, malt-forward lager called Wiesenbier or Oktoberfest beer, at 6.1% alcohol by volume. It was stronger than the everyday Helles, richer in character. Brewed specifically for the celebration and available nowhere else at the same time. 2 of the festival's large tents, the Löwenbräu Festhalle and the Schützenfestzelt, were sponsored and managed by the brewery. Together they could accommodate thousands of visitors per sitting, the long tables filling and emptying through the hours with a kind of ancient rhythmic joy that had nothing to do with marketing strategy and everything to do with something far older. By the 1960s and early 70s, Löwenbräu's Oktoberfest presence was making it the most recognizable symbol of German beer culture to the outside world. The mechanical lion, the green tents, the 6-liter Maßkrug glasses. The image was irresistible. But an image, by itself, is a dangerous thing to sell, especially when someone else controls the selling. 1974, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Miller Brewing Company was one of the most powerful beer corporations in the United States, a subsidiary of Philip Morris Incorporated, the tobacco giant, with ambitions to dominate the premium beer segment of the American market. Its primary rival, Anheuser-Busch, had a brand called Michelob that occupied the prestige tier of American beer consumption. Miller needed a weapon. Miller found its weapon in Munich. The arrangement, formalized in 1974, gave Miller Brewing the North American rights to the Löwenbräu brand. For the first 2 years, Miller did what anyone with genuine respect for the product would do. It imported the real thing. Genuine Löwenbräu from the Nymphenburger Strasse brewery arrived in American ports and made its way onto American shelves. Sales were promising. The positioning was perfect. Here was a 600-year-old Bavarian brewery, Grand Prix winner at the Paris World Exhibition, a fixture of Oktoberfest, brewed under the purity laws of 1516, and it was available at your local liquor store. Löwenbräu had become the top German import into the United States, roughly tied with Heineken of the Netherlands for the leading imported beer position. The United States was then importing only 1% of its total beer consumption. To be the top name within that 1% was enormously valuable. Then Miller made its decision. In 1977, after 2 years of genuine imports, Miller stopped shipping from Munich entirely. It began brewing Löwenbräu domestically at its own American facilities using its own American process. And the formula it used was not the formula from Nymphenburger Strasse. Other grains, including corn grits, were introduced into the malt. The extended lagering time that gave Löwenbräu its characteristic clean finish was shortened for efficiency. Artificial ingredients were incorporated, ingredients that would have been expressly prohibited under the Reinheitsgebot that Miller was simultaneously advertising as the basis of Löwenbräu's purity. Miller spent $20 million in 1986 alone promoting the brand in the United States, according to Advertising Age. The jingle, "Here's to Good Friends," performed first by the baritone jazz singer Arthur Prysock and later by Clint Holmes, ran on American television from 1977 to 1985. The campaign was elaborate. The presentation was immaculate. But what was inside the bottle was a lie, and Anheuser-Busch knew it. 1977, Washington, D.C. Anheuser-Busch, the company whose Michelob brand Miller had intended Löwenbräu to displace, was not a passive competitor. When Miller began producing its domestic version of Löwenbräu and continued advertising it as a beer brewed under the standards of the German Reinheitsgebot, Anheuser-Busch moved swiftly and aggressively. The company filed a formal complaint with the Federal Trade Commission. The allegation was explicit. Miller Brewing was engaged in deceptive advertising, marketing an American-made beer with artificial and non-traditional ingredients as though it were an authentic German import brewed according to centuries-old purity law. The corn grits, the altered fermentation process, the labeling that obscured the beer's true American origin. The FTC investigation drew significant public attention. Beer journalists, industry analysts, and newspaper reporters began examining what Miller had actually done to the recipe. The more they looked, the less the product resembled its German namesake. No formal regulatory action was ultimately taken. The FTC did not issue penalties. Miller did not face a legal judgment, but the court of public opinion rendered its verdict independently, and that verdict was far more damaging than any fine. Sales of Löwenbräu in the American market collapsed. The premium image, the carefully constructed story of Alpine purity, medieval traditions, and Bavarian craftsmanship had been exposed as packaging. American consumers who had been paying premium prices for what they believed was a genuine imported German beer felt deceived. They moved on, to Heineken, to Beck's, to the new wave of American craft beers beginning to emerge in the early 1980s. Michelob remained the dominant force in the American premium segment. Miller's grand strategy, the entire reason it had purchased the Löwenbräu rights, had failed. Miller Brewing Company spent a total of more than 2 decades managing the Löwenbräu brand in North America, but it never recovered the credibility that the brand had possessed during those first 2 years of genuine imports. The tagline eventually shifted from "This world belongs to Löwenbräu" to "This night calls for Löwenbräu." A quiet retreat from global claims to local moments, a reduction of ambition dressed as creativity. Back in Munich, the executives watching all of this unfold understood something had been broken. Not just in the American market, something essential had been broken in the brand itself. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything, and it helps us keep making these in-depth historical documentaries. The final chapters of the Lion story are the most dramatic yet. 1982, Munich, Bavaria. While the American disaster was unfolding across the Atlantic, a quieter but equally consequential transformation was taking place inside the corporate structure of Löwenbräu AG itself. In 1982, the family of August von Fink, reported at the time to be the wealthiest man in Bavaria, acquired a 90% controlling interest in Löwenbräu AG through a holding company called Agricole Verwaltungsgesellschaft. Von Fink was not acquiring a brewery in the way that passionate brewers acquire breweries. He was acquiring an asset portfolio. And the most valuable asset Löwenbräu possessed was not its recipes, not its Oktoberfest tents, not even its famous mechanical lion. It was the land. The brewery's decades of expansion across Munich had made it one of the most significant private real estate holders in the city, second only to the municipal government. Approximately 10,000 acres of land in and around Munich had been accumulated across more than a century of acquisitions. Properties from other breweries absorbed in mergers, adjacent lots purchased during expansion, sites held through wartime and post-war reconstruction. The von Fink acquisition recognized something that the brewing industry had overlooked. Löwenbräu was sitting on a fortune in land. Over the following years, the corporation's structure was reorganized multiple times, with the real estate operations eventually separated from the brewing operations into distinct entities. The brewery itself was becoming a smaller portion of what Löwenbräu AG actually was. Internationally, the brand was reaching its widest geographic footprint. By one count, in the mid-1980s, Löwenbräu was being exported to 140 countries. In 1983, the brewery signed an agreement with Asahi Breweries of Japan to produce the beer locally for the Japanese market, where genuine Munich imports had been available for 6 years. Licensed production was operating across multiple countries simultaneously. The global presence was impressive on paper, but licensed production carries its own dangers. Each local version brewed under license introduced variables in water quality, malt sourcing, and process control that the Munich brewers could not fully supervise. The brand was spreading geographically even as its core identity in the United States was being steadily eroded. By 1996 and 1997, the financial picture inside the brewery itself had turned bleak. The core brewing operation posted a net deficit of 18 million Deutschmarks in the 1996-97 financial year. The lion was bleeding money. 1997, Munich, Bavaria. They had competed for more than a century. Side by side on the same city streets, their beer halls separated by short walking distances, their marketing teams in permanent Cold War over the same customers. Löwenbräu and Spattenbrau, two of the oldest breweries in Munich, two of the 6 permitted at Oktoberfest, two institutions whose rivalry had helped define Bavarian brewing culture since the 1800s. In 1963 and 64, when Löwenbräu first claimed its position as Munich's largest brewery with a 25% market share, it was Spaten that had then risen to challenge it. For decades, the two companies had traded market leadership back and forth, each driving the other to sharper brewing and bolder investment. In October of 1997, they merged. Gabriel Sedlmayr Spaten Francis Connor Bra KGaA acquired a 96% controlling interest in Löwenbräu AG. The new combined entity, eventually known as the Spaten-Löwenbräu Group, represented the end of independent Löwenbräu as Munich had known it for generations. The brewery that had once stood alone as Germany's largest was now folded into its oldest rival, consolidated for cost efficiency with shared marketing, administration, and operational functions. In North America, the Miller arrangement was simultaneously collapsing under the weight of its own damaged reputation. In 1999, the North American rights to Löwenbräu passed from Miller to the Labatt Brewing Company, which was owned by the Belgian conglomerate Interbrew. Labatt began producing Löwenbräu in Canada according to the authentic German recipe, a pointed repudiation of everything Miller had done, and distributed it across both the Canadian and American markets. But it was too late to fully repair what Miller had broken. The American premium beer consumer of 1999 was not the same as the consumer of 1975. The craft beer revolution was underway. Sierra Nevada, Samuel Adams, and dozens of smaller independent breweries were offering American drinkers something they had never had before: genuinely complex, interesting, locally produced beer at prices only slightly higher than mainstream lagers. Löwenbräu, which had once been the archetype of sophistication in the American market, was now competing in a landscape it had not anticipated and could not navigate from an office in Munich. Sales in North America remained a fraction of what they had been before the Miller deal. Meanwhile, back in Europe, something much larger was approaching. October 1st, 2004, Brussels, Belgium. On that date, ownership of the Spaten Franziskaner Löwenbräu Group was formally transferred to InBev, the Belgian brewing conglomerate that had been formed by the merger of Interbrew with the Brazilian giant Companhia de Bebidas das Americas, known as Ambev. The transaction valued the brewery operations at approximately 477 million Deutschmarks, or the equivalent of 537 million American dollars at the time. The deal made Interbrew Deutschland, the German subsidiary, which now also included Beck's, the top brewer in Germany by total sales volume. For the Lion, this was not a merger. This was an absorption. InBev was not a brewing company in the traditional sense. It was a financial mechanism for aggregating beer brands across global markets, reducing production costs through economies of scale, and maximizing shareholder returns. The companies it acquired were assessed for brand value, production efficiency, and geographic market access. The centuries of tradition, the Reinheitsgebot heritage, the Oktoberfest tent, the mechanical roaring lion, these were marketing assets, categorized and priced accordingly. When InBev itself merged with Anheuser-Busch in 2008, in a transaction valued at 52 billion American dollars, the largest acquisition in the history of the brewing industry, Löwenbräu found itself owned by a company whose brands included Budweiser, Stella Artois, Corona, and Beck's. The company's estimated annual sales were 55 billion American dollars. Its global market share approached 28% of all beer sold on Earth. Löwenbräu was now a line item in a portfolio of more than 500 brands. The original Munich brewery on Nymphenburger Straße, the facility that Georg Brey had built from the ground up beginning in 1827, the plant that had produced Germany's finest beer for more than a century, was closed in 2006. Production was consolidated at the neighboring Spaten facility. Brewing was centralized. Costs were reduced. The character of the beer, particularly in international markets where it was produced under license by Anheuser-Busch InBev subsidiaries, began to change. Beer critics and longtime consumers reported a product that was lighter, thinner, less complex than the version brewed in Munich under the old management. The lion's roar was becoming quieter, and quieter, and quieter still. 2006 and beyond, Munich, Bavaria, and everywhere. The closure of the original Nymphenburger Straße brewery was not announced with fanfare. It came quietly, as a corporate operational decision, one production site consolidated into another. To the casual observer on the street, little seemed to have changed. The Löwenbräu Keller still stood at Stiegelmeierplatz, its grand facade intact, its beer gardens still filling with tourists and locals every warm evening. The Oktoberfest tents still carried the Löwenbräu name, and the mechanical lion still roared above the entrance to the Löwenbräu Festhalle on the Wiesn. But behind the facade, the story was very different. The leadership of what had once been Germany's greatest independent brewing empire was now conducted from an office in Bremen, a city in northern Germany, far removed from Munich, far removed from Bavaria, far removed from the Alps and the Hallertau hops and the deep Bavarian wells that had made the beer what it was. The brand was administered by Anheuser-Busch InBev's German operations, managed alongside Beck's and a roster of other acquired names. Proposals emerged periodically to relocate even the remaining Löwenbräu operations, to fully merge them into the Spaten facility, to eliminate the separate identity entirely. Industry reports suggested that the beer's recipe had been adjusted in international markets, that cheaper ingredients had been substituted, that the brewing process had been streamlined in ways inconsistent with the Reinheitsgebot-era ethos the brand continued to invoke in its marketing. Consumer reviews in the beer enthusiast community became increasingly critical. Many describe the modern international version of Löwenbräu as an average mass-market lager with little resemblance to the complex, malt-forward beer that had won a Grand Prix in Paris more than a century earlier. On specialist beer rating platforms, the scores clustered in the middling range. Meanwhile, Augustinerbräu, Löwenbräu's fellow Oktoberfest brewery, the oldest of the six, had maintained its independence. It remained Munich-owned, Munich-managed, brewed to traditional standards, and fiercely resistant to acquisition. Its reputation grew steadily stronger even as Löwenbräu's declined. The contrast was instructive and painful. The Labatt Brewing Company eventually reacquired North American brewing rights for Löwenbräu in 2014, producing the beer at its facility in London, Ontario. The circle of compromise production, started by Miller in 1977, continued turning. But here's the thing, the name still matters. The tent still fills. The lion still roars. And somewhere in that contradiction lies the final chapter of this story. Walk through Munich today and the Löwenbräu name is still everywhere. The Löwenbräu Keller at Stiegelmeierplatz still serves beer from gleaming copper taps. The Oktoberfest tent still draws tens of thousands of visitors who raise their Moss Crew glasses beneath the green banners. The mechanical lion still opens its mouth and roars. If you look closely enough, however, you can see the seams. The original brewery building on Nymphenburger Strasse, where Georg Brey first unified his production operations in 1851, is no longer a brewery. The brand that proudly bore the Lion's name is a corporate asset, managed from an office in a different city, owned by a conglomerate whose headquarters are in Leuven, Belgium. A brewery that once claimed 600 years of unbroken Bavarian heritage is today a regional sub-brand within a portfolio that controls roughly 28% of all beer sold on the planet. 3 lessons echo through this story, and none of them require a lecture to be understood. The first is the lesson of identity. Löwenbräu built its entire competitive advantage on one thing. It was from here. The water, the hops, the Reinheitsgebot, the Oktoberfest exclusivity. Every element of its value was geographic, cultural, and specific. The moment that identity was divorced from the product, the moment Miller Brewing began putting American corn grits into Bavarian Lion bottles, the brand's value began its irreversible erosion. An identity is not a logo. It is the accumulation of specific, authentic, irreproducible choices. Sell those choices cheaply and you cannot buy them back. The second is the lesson of scale. Every expansion Löwenbräu pursued beyond the borders of Bavaria required it to dilute what made it Löwenbräu. Licensed production in 40 countries, an American contract with a company that valued efficiency over authenticity, a merger with a competitor to reduce costs, an acquisition by a global conglomerate. Each step was defensible on its own financial logic. Each step moved the lion further from its mountain. The third is the lesson of independence. Augustinerbräu, the brewery that refused to be acquired, remains the most respected institution at Oktoberfest today. Löwenbräu, which accepted merger after merger, is a name on a label managed from Bremen. The difference is not talent. It is not tradition. It is the courage to say no to money when money wants to change what you are. 600 years of operation, a peak production of 1.5 million hectoliters, Germany's largest brewery at the turn of the 20th century, exported to 140 countries at the height of its global reach. Today, a sub-brand of AB InBev. Original Munich brewery closed since 2006. What's left is the legend. And legends can be owned, but they cannot be manufactured. The Lion's Brew was once the greatest beer in Germany. What it tells us now is simpler and sadder and more universal. That greatness, once sold, is almost impossible to reclaim.